classification that's not in your position requirement, it will be eliminated by this. And that takes away flexibility from the city. On a policy level, the reason that pay enhancements are in there, some of these incentive structures, are to allow, I guess there are two ways you can do it. In order to get somebody to take a job that's dangerous, to do a night shift or something like that, you can either raise their base pay across the board, which then increases rates for overtime and everything else, or you can do specialized incentive structures. So you're going to say, we're going to pay them for the period that they're on the top of an electrical pole, for the period that they're on the bomb squad, for the time that you're actually working on a night shift. And by eliminating this, by taking away those types of incentive structures, you're eliminating it for all departments, all 2,200 represented employees, without looking at the specific needs of that department and the specific needs of that division in order to incentivize pay. You're essentially tying the Assembly's hands for the future and tying the hands of future assemblies. And that's just one example of where the Assembly's hands are being tied by this ordinance. Under the ordinance, the Assembly would be forbidden from approving labor contracts unless they contain a managed competition clause. They would be forbidden from approving a labor contract that goes above CPI, regardless of what the market conditions are. You'd be forbidden from applying pay enhancements for education, shifts, hazard pay. You'd have to have uniform benefits, holidays for all departments, regardless of what is needed within that specific department. And I think there are a lot of different needs, from the fire department to municipal light and power. Some departments need certain fire retardant clothing or different types of benefit structures or shift structures in order to have a 24-hour coverage at a power plant or for the police dispatchers. There are different needs in different departments, and a lot of this is requiring uniform systems that don't make sense for the city. I find this unusual. I haven't seen many ordinances that prohibit the Assembly from action, and this is repeated throughout here. The Assembly shall not. The Assembly will not be allowed to ratify an agreement unless it contains. No collective bargaining agreement will be ratified by the Assembly if it contains certain provisions. Over and over again, you're tying your own hands on dealing with future labor issues. And I guess the question it raises is why? Why would the Assembly want to tie its own hands and limit its own flexibility? And these are a couple other examples that can't vary from the Fair Labor Standards Act, has to offer uniform benefits regardless. Another area that I think needs to be addressed is movement of power from the Assembly to the Mayor's office, to the executive branch. And I think there was some confusion last week on the Employee Relations Board and how it's appointed. I think the statement was made that Labor appoints one member, the Mayor appoints one member, and those two work together to appoint a third. And that's not what the current law says. It's not what the ordinance says. All three are appointed by the Mayor and then approved by the Assembly. And I think as mayors change, so did philosophies on the ERB. Looking at the ERB, under this proposal, essentially what is happening is that there are some decisions of the ERB that look to be non-reviewable at all. So if the ERB decides under section 050D6 who should be excluded from bargaining, it says that's the final decision under the current ordinance, that's the final decision. It seems to be limiting any appeal from that. And then if you go to section 140K, it says that all appeals from the Employee Relations Board shall only be by gross error, which is a very high standard of review. It's higher than arbitrary and capricious. It's only allowed essentially if it's obvious and significant error. So power is being moved to the ERB and to the Mayor's office that is essentially not reviewable by the courts. Just to conclude, this ordinance has so many problems. We've touched on a few of them today, but it's going to be impossible to implement. It has conflicting terms throughout. It suffers from basic lack of definitions. It removes power from the assembly. It gives virtually unchecked power to the Employee Relations Board to interpret the terms of this ordinance. And again, these are your words. This is your ordinance. This is the legislative branch acting and then giving power, exclusive power, to the executive branch to interpret what those words mean. It'll lead to more complicated and longer collective bargaining agreements by the elimination of past practice. It'll lead to disputes over internal conflicts and unclear use of language. And it will lead to significant issues with withdrawal liability and unconstitutional diminishment of benefits. We really don't have time in this work session to go through on a section-by-section basis and address all of the problems. We could spend an entire period just talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act. We're going department by department on problems with shifts and scheduling that this will cause. But I think the big issue is that there really is no problem that's being fixed. It's not clear to us what is trying to be addressed by this ordinance. It abandons 4 decades of history under the National Labor Relations Act, and 4 decades of positive relations history here in Anchorage. By taking away the National Labor Relations Act model, we have new definitions and terms that are going to need to be addressed and defined. It's a system of radical changes throughout the ordinance, and it really, in our view, is just a train wreck waiting to happen. With that, I think I answered your question.
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation, and I'm going to do the same process. I'll be bouncing back and forth. My appreciation to my fellow assembly members from the last meeting. You each took 5 to 7 minutes, which will be perfect to wrap this up. So with that, Mr. Holman, you're going to be the first comment.
Okay, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. On one area in the health insurance, and I'm not sure who to direct this at, but you're talking about the complexity of the program, and I appreciated being informed that the complexity didn't come from negotiated labor agreements on this. This is an administrative direction that they chose, thought would be the best. And so my question is that, as you probably admit, that 680 different types of programs or combinations is a pretty administrative nightmare. How would we fix this in your, I guess, description? Is this something that you would be willing to set down and help the administration? I mean, you clearly admitted it's not necessarily your role. You usually work around the periphery of it, like co-pays. But how would you suggest fixing this to try to make it less complex administratively, perhaps saving money there?
You don't need to change, Matt. You don't need to change in the ordinance. We don't have any choice. Every time a contract comes up, health insurance is a mandatory subject of bargaining. And the health insurance, because the city employs the consultants and the city has the area-wide plan, the city is the leader in health insurance. So if the city decides to change its health insurance program, it can already do that. If the city decides to limit the benefits, instead of offering a cafeteria style that they have now, which is a lot, if they decide to go to fewer choices. Typically, we would go to the bargaining table and we would not really be asked about that. We would be saying, guys, we decided it's this administrative nightmare, and the benefits are still about like they were, but we're going to go a different direction with health insurance, and we can kick and scream if we want to, but we really don't have the bargaining power or the horsepower to have a whole lot of influence on where it goes in health insurance. Where you find us bargaining is on the copay issues. And you see a lot of difference in the contracts on that. And that's where the big fear here is, because that's part of the overall wage package. And I'll just make one quick analogy. When you sit down with a construction contractor on behalf of, say, the iron workers, typically, sort of, figuratively reach in the wall and says, $2, you get $2. And the argument isn't at the table. The argument's back at the union hall. How much goes on the pension? How much goes on the wage? How much goes for the training trust? How much goes for the benevolent fund? And the union dukes it out. Well, when you're in bargaining with the city, one of the things I keep telling all the lawyers in the bargaining units I represent, and believe me, there are quite a few, is that you don't have any constitutional right to this health benefit. It's negotiable, and it's money, and it counts the same as the other money. And so when you end up with a generous copay, invariably, you've not gotten something else. It's a trade. There's only so much money at the table. So when you go through these contracts and you equalize benefits, you're cherry picking these contracts and you're hosing these employees. And the way to do it is through collective bargaining, the way you do it now. One last thing, I'll shut up. All of these contracts were negotiated by the administration and approved by the assembly. If you think that prior administrations got off the tracks, remember, it wasn't the labor code that was broken. It's not the labor code that's broken now. The labor code gives you the roadmap to change things the way you want to. It will require that you be reasonable. It sets out procedures. It can't be done suddenly, but the roadmap is there. And I think, I'm clearly not a fan of this mayor and his policies, but I'll tell you what, his collective bargaining agreements so far have been pretty tight. And it doesn't seem to me that this mayor is having a whole lot of trouble at the bargaining table keeping costs under control.
So the next question, briefly, I don't know what my time is.
I was just going to add one comment that it also seemed from the presentation last week that the change is not to uniform, well, it's a uniformity of costs. It's unclear to us whether we're actually going to be getting rid of the 600 plans or just changing the cost structure of all 600.
So then, I'm going to past practice. And again, I don't know who to direct this to, but under the current code and under the current practice, if you can't settle it through the grievance process, it goes to an arbitrator or mediator, a fact finder, one of those that's built into the code in collective bargaining, I'm assuming. Is that correct?
Typically an arbitrator.
Okay. And I understood your explanation of it's defined for over 50 years. I read that through here, and I heard you say a little bit that what defining past practice is fairly clear. What's done currently, just short of going to an arbitrator, when you decide, like a lawsuit, if you settle agreements, to try to perhaps eliminate, for instance, if management would say, if I agree to this and I settle, let's say the next 10 guys that feel they got grieved or got wronged come to the door and say, yeah, me too, me too, me too. What's currently done now to, I guess you could say, to balance that advantage one way or the other, to make it more fair when you settle agreements?
Yeah, well, I settle a lot of grievances. We settle almost all of our grievances. And you sit down with management, and using the example of the guys that were on deployment, the city came back and we're going to fix the economic problem and on a non-precedent basis. So we get that fixed and nobody's rights are affected. Then I've got an offer to the city. Let's sit down and talk about how you want to adjust this, and can we have a meeting with some of our military guys at the table so we can get their input and talk about how we're going to go forward. It looks to me like we may be doing some changing on that, but what I'll tell you is I don't want to represent a bargaining unit that gets to the bargaining table as the enemy. What you want to do is you want to represent a bargaining unit that gets to the table, and the people are looking across from you are guys that you've worked on problems together, you've been collaborative, you've been reasonable, and that's the process. So typically we don't have a lot of grievances, they just settle. And there are all kinds of ways to settle them. And I don't believe we can settle a case now that doesn't come before you anymore. I think you've seen them all.
But does that establish a past practice? For instance, if somebody says, this military thing you gave an example of, the next guy going deployed, does he then get to say me too? Or?
The way we do these settlements nowadays, most of the settlement agreements are on a non-precedent basis, and they're only available to be used as evidence to enforce their own terms. So it's easy to settle a case that happened, a 1 in a million case. You just settle it and go move on, and it has no precedent value. But that's usually handled by the parties. But in the absence of an agreement, of a non-precedent agreement, then a settlement does have precedent.
That's all for now. I'll come back.
Thank you, Paul. Mr. Birch?
No questions at this time. Thank you for the presentations.
Ms. Johnston?
So, as far as talking about the PERS liability, and on page 21, using the language from that, and page 23, you brought up our participation in the state's PERS program. And the way I read it, and I might be missing something here, but it says the last sentence,
What page?
page 21, and then 23 was citing the PERS. It said, unless such a tax or fee was agreed to in advance by the municipality, which is most of our pension programs as such now. And granted, I'm spending quite a bit of time on the PERS program right now. And it is in flux, but it's still something that would be agreed upon before. I don't see where this is I don't understand why this is an example why this language is bad. Am I missing something?
I don't think that you're in danger of excise taxes and so on in your PERS plan. Ms. Johnson, what I would ask you to do when you talk with your people, ask them if the 22% contribution covers the benefit, or if part of that covers the unfunded liability. I think the answer is that part of it covers the unfunded liability.
Right,
So
but it
you're
doesn't-
already